This lecture has been made available to you courtesy of the American Numismatic Society.
Christopher Bach is an associate member of the American Numismatic Society. He is formerly trained and currently works in the field of architecture. Bach has a lifelong interest in and passion for sculpture. First experience in his youth seeing the great monuments and public sculpture throughout New York City by Augustus Saint-Gaudens, Daniel Chester French, Paul Manship, and other notable sculptors. This led to a concentration in research in collecting the Beaux-Arts medallic art, both French and American, for which Victor David Brenner's work is fittingly included. So please welcome with me Christopher Bach.
Thank you, Jesse. Thank you, Jesse. Good afternoon. I wanted to thank the ANS, first of all, for hosting this important event, a two-day event on Brenner and his work. I also wanted to thank both Scott Miller and Jesse for their support in researching the Soroya Medallion. This is Looking for Selfish, 1919, quite a bit later by Soroya, but it is characteristic of his later work with large brushstrokes, texture, and light. This is one of several paintings that includes figures within a landscape of rock formations, similar to Brenner's Soroya medal that we'll be seeing shortly. I wanted to just quickly read the statement that I had submitted for the conference. I thought it was important to hear that, as it will put the context of the presentation into some perspective. The year 1909 was a momentous occasion for commemorations and celebrations, particularly in New York City, marked by historic events, medallic art, numismatics, and a painting exhibition that was deemed the most emphatic success ever known in the history of art in New York. The centennial of the birth of Abraham Lincoln was widely commemorated in a year-long celebration throughout the United States, concluding perhaps in the much anticipated release of the new Lincoln Cent designed by Victor David Brenner, and to great public interest on August 2nd, 1909. Early that year, encouraged and arranged by Archer Milton Huntington, the Spanish Impressionist painter Joaquín Sorolla y Bastida exhibited at the Historic Society of America in New York City from February 4th to March 9th. It was a blockbuster with 356 paintings exhibited, some 170,000 people attending, and Soroya selling an impressive 195 paintings. These events were perhaps the culminating points of both Brenner and Soroya's artistic careers. While the influence of French masters and medallists, Chaplin and Roti were characteristic of Brenner's medallic art, it was perhaps the commission for the historic Hispanic Society's Soroya Medallion in 1909 that was seemingly unusual, a seemingly unusual departure in contrast to Brenner's more formal portrait composition pieces. The proposal looks at both artists' work and the stylistic influences that led to Brenner's curious Soroya Medallion and the medallic work that immediately followed. So there in the center is Brenner's Soroya Medallion. And I just wanted to note in the background is Brenner modeling from life the young lover's sculpture, also known as Nature the Consoler of 1907, and that image was taken from the Art and Craft of the Medalists, written by Brenner in 1907 and published in the Scientific American. And I did want to note in the center there, I believe is Lincoln's death mass that is hanging up on the wall in between. And you'll also see a live male nude model to the left that Brenner is sculpting from. Though clearly not complete, looking at Brenner's medallic work in the roughly 20-year span between 1900 and 1920, for me, the Soroya medal of 1910 was a very unusual contrast to Brenner's other work, with most of his medals and plaquettes executed in low relief, and the Soroya in a high relief with accentuated lines and deep shadows. So knowing Brenner's work and the time frame between roughly 1900, 1920, we've got the Soroya medallion that is kind of mid-span there and is really quite unusual in comparison to most of Brenner's other work. It's also interesting to note that Chaplin dies the year before 1910, I think in 1909, and Roti dies in 1911, the year after the Sorolla medal. And I believe, kind of on speculation, that it was the death of these two great masters and his work that he had admired so much really affected maybe Brenner into a certain extent. And so the departure of the Soroya medallion is maybe homage to both sculptors in many ways, which we'll look at in a moment. When researching the Soroya medal, it was important for me to put the medal into the context of what was going on a few years prior to and following the completion of the Soroya medal in 1910. Many of the key sequence of events, people, and influences that may have played a factor in the Soroya medal development are noted, some of which we'll talk about this afternoon. Here is a photograph of visitors arriving, including Ford's newly released 1908-09 Model T, lining up to the Hispanic Society of America for Sorolla's exhibition in February 1909. In the spring of 1908, Huntington discovers the work of Soroya in London at a time when the Hispanic Society of America was just completing their new building in Manhattan at 155th Street and Broadway. Huntington immediately arranges a retrospective of his work, the first at the Hispanic Society and the first major exhibition in the Western Hemisphere of paintings by Soroya, by Spain's acclaimed master. The exhibition takes place from February 4th to March 9th, 1909, and is a huge success. Here we see Soroya on the steps of the Hispanic Society just before the opening to the public in February 1909. And here is an interior view of the Soroya exhibit, looking at the east wall of the newly completed Hispanic Society. In the background center at the gallery, above the back wall, is a painting Soroya did called Beaching the Boat, Afternoon Light, 1903, which Huntington purchases immediately, and is one of several paintings that Huntington would acquire for the museum around the time of its opening. And to give you a sense of scale, that painting is roughly 10 feet tall by 14 feet wide. It's a little larger than this white panel that we see behind the screen in front of us. Beaching the Boat, Afternoon Light of 1903, Soroya's name was unfamiliar to most American museum visitors at the time, even though he was hailed as a master of light by no less an artist than Monet himself. He was also often referred to as the John Singer Sargent of Spain, revered in Spain as the nation's last great traditional painter. Sorolla was the epitome of a successful artist and a talented student. By 1900, he became one of Europe's leading artists. Sorolla excelled in the painting of portraits, landscapes, and monumental works of social and historical themes. Though he lived in Madrid, he returned often to his native Valencia, a town in the southeast coast, where he painted beach scenes that allowed him to focus on the study of light. He was struck by the daily sight of fishermen maneuvering teams of oxen to beach their boats at the end of the day, a scene captured in this monumental canvas of 1903. This heroic image of daily labor shows Sorolla recording the fall of light with extraordinary precision, while simultaneously employing Impressionism's unmixed colors and the freer brushwork. Overall, it is an image that demonstrates the artist's equal allegiance to the Spanish tradition of realism and to the advanced art of his own day. And here are a couple of other paintings that Huntington purchases right before the exhibit of 1909. The Louis Comfort Tiffany portrait was later purchased, I think, within the last couple of decades. And all three of these paintings are also at the Hispanic Society. I should note that Sorolla, while in the United States around 1909, 010, and even 11, he returns later on, does over 20 portraits, one of which is President Taft in 1909. But Sorolla's acknowledged mastery as a portraitist brought many commissions in 1909 to 1910, and even at $5,000 for a full-length portrait, $3,000 for a half-length, and $2,000 for a head, prospective sitters were not deterred. So this is a great painting of Tiffany out on Long Island in his garden. And then I wanted to just wrap up some of my discussions on Soroya's work. He did, after the exhibit of 1909, he was commissioned by Huntington in 1911 to do a series of paintings called The Vision of Spain, or also known as the Provinces of Spain. And he was commissioned again in 1911 by Huntington, and it is a series of monumental canvases by Sorolla depicting the customs, costumes, and traditions of regions of Spain. In the center is the painting El Pescado, the fish, completed in 1915. And to give you a sense of scale there, that's about 11 and a half feet tall by 16 feet wide. Early in 1911, Soroya visited the United States for a second time and exhibited 152 new paintings at the St. Louis Art Museum and 161 at the Art Institute of Chicago a few weeks later. Later that year, Soroya would meet Huntington in Paris and signed a contract to paint a series of oils on life in Spain. These 14 magnificent murals, installed to this day in the Hispanic Society, range from 12 to 14 feet in height and a total of 227 feet in length. So quite large paintings. This was a major commission of his career, and it would dominate the later years of Soroya's life. Despite the immensity of the canvases, Soroya painted all but one in plein air and traveled to specific locales to paint them, at each site painting models posed in local costume. Each mural celebrated the landscape and culture of its region, panoramas composed of throngs of laborers and locals, and by 1917, he was, by his own admission, exhausted. He completed the final panel by July 1919. Soroya suffered a stroke in 1920 while painting a portrait in his garden in Madrid. Paralyzed for over 3 years, he died on the 10th of August, 1923. And the Soroya room houses the providences of Spain at the Hispanic Society and was open to the public in 1926. That's one of the murals there, the fish. And I think in Soroya's work, in particular, after the 1909 exhibit and the Soroya medal done by Brenner, Soroya travels throughout Spain, producing hundreds and hundreds of sketches he's composing of laborers and workers and the Spanish people in various regions, and he's sending those back to Huntington as things are developing and creating these 14 murals. We know that as early as May 1908, Soroya is made a member of the Hispanic Society. This is the medal for the Hispanic Society of America, done by Emile Fuchs in 1906. And these are actually Soroya's medals. They're both, this one is in silver and 76 millimeters or 3 inches in diameter. And there are several correspondents in the museum, the Soroya Museum in Madrid, that are between Soroya and Huntington, where Huntington is announcing the voting of the board and making him a member of the society. And then the following year, in May of 1909, he is awarded the Hispanic Society of America's Medal of Arts and Literature, also done by Fuchs, and again, other correspondence between Huntington and Soroya announcing that. So as early as even before the 1909 exhibit in New York City, he is made a member of the society in 1908. We know that Huntington discovers Soroya's paintings in London in the spring of 1908. And so I think very early on, the stage has kind of been set to not only have the exhibit of Soroya's work here in New York, but for Brenner to execute the Soroya Medallion. There's no record, as far as I can tell, in the museum, the Sorolla Museum in Spain, that has a copy of the Brenner medal, but we're still looking into that. I thought I would throw a couple of slides in for context of what was going on in 1909 in New York City. And here we've got the New York to Seattle ocean-to-ocean automobile endurance contest or race that was started in Lower Manhattan on June 1st, 1909. I knew nothing about it, but it was interesting. Robert Guggenheim is promoting the automobile with Ford and others, and the development and construction of highways across the United States. So they staged this kind of marketing PR event where they start in New York and end in Seattle at the Alaska Yukon Pacific expedition, both of which started at the same day on June 1st. And here in the photograph here, we've got Ford's Model Ts, car numbered 1 and 2. They win the race. And interestingly enough, it was just this past May that Ford took their new electric Mustang e-car and with the car number 2 have been driving across the country, kind of reenacting that race of 1909. And here today, Ford showing their car of the Model T of 1909 and the future of their new electric car. And of course, in the summer of 1909, we've got the Lincoln Cent, which is made public. Here we've got an image of folks lined up down at Federal Hall or at the US Sub-Treasury down in Wall Street. And the penny or the cent was released on August 2nd, 1909. This quote from Putnam's magazine in October kind of describes what was going on during the release of the penny. I don't know which seems more absurd, the scramble for these new pennies or the outcry against Mr. Brenner's initials. Millions of the coins were struck off so that they can never become really scarce, yet the cops had to impose their heaven to witness the outrage of his feelings inflicted by this latest official insult to art. Midsummer madness, all of it. So we know the controversy behind the Brenner initials, but I think the release of the Lincoln Cent is probably one of the culminating points of Brenner's career in 1909, as well again as the Soroya exposition at the Hispanic Society. We also have in 1909 in New York, we've got the Hudson Fulton celebration. Brenner would execute the Aero Club of America Wright Brothers Medal a year earlier in 1908 that commemorated the Wright brothers' flight that year in Le Mans, France, and Fort Myer, Virginia. But interestingly enough, during the Hudson Fulton celebration, the Wright brothers are hired to fly up and down the Hudson River and do a couple of loops around the Statue of Liberty. So here you see Wilbur Wright in the top left corner circling the Statue of Liberty and heading back to Governor's Island during his 7-minute flight. And I thought I would note that the dark object underneath the airplane's wing is actually a canoe. So I think they were worried about perhaps landing in the Hudson River, and so they rigged up a canoe to the bottom. But the Brenner's Wright Brothers Medal of 1908 was actually awarded at the White House ceremony on June 10th, 1909. So that was happening as well to honor the achievements of the Wright brothers in navigating the air. And then, of course, we have Fuchs' Hudson Fulton Celebration medallion. And interestingly enough, not only were there naval parades and other spectacles during this 2-week celebration, but all of the major monuments in New York City were decorated with light. And even the Brooklyn Museum was decorated. And so we had these great, huge structures and buildings and monuments in New York that were just kind of illuminated with light during this 2-week period, which I thought was quite interesting. There are 14 letters from Brenner to Huntington in the Hispanic Society's archives, and probably only 4 responses from Huntington himself. And most of these early on, a couple of these deal with the Soroya medal and its design. And here Brenner is asking, there's a question in my mind whether a motto should go well on its reverse. And he's asking Huntington for a reply and whether or not he could come by and stop by his studio for a while to review the development of the Soroya Medallion. And in this letter, a couple days later, this is late December 1909, he says, with this, I am sending to you the clay models of what I think would make a good medal. There are, oddly enough, no responses from Huntington regarding the Soroya medal specifically. But what happens in January of 1910, Huntington is introduced to an article published by Brenner that we talked about in the beginning of the presentation, The Art and Craft of the Medalist, that was published in the Scientific American in June 22nd, 1907. And Huntington suggests to Brenner in the making of the Soroya medal, but it's also the planning for the international exhibition of contemporary medals. Huntington reaches out to Brenner and suggests that the Scientific American article that he wrote be expanded and medals added, descriptions added, and there's Huntington seems to be fixated on publishing Brenner's work in a pamphlet of some sort that would be handed out at the International Exhibition of Contemporary Medals. And that turns out to be The Art of the Medal in 1910. So pamphlets are made. Brenner is focused at the 11th hour before the opening of the exhibit on layout and providing photographs and documentation of his medallic work, and rewriting his earlier article that would later become the art of the medal. And there's no record of these being handed out, although in these correspondence between Brenner and Huntington, they are talking about quantities of printing and pamphlets and availability. So Huntington is fixated on Brenner developing this pamphlet, while Brenner is continuing to write Huntington, asking him questions about the Soroya Medallion. And then in late February 1910, we've got this another letter here from Brenner, where he says that Mr. Starkweather remarked today that the upper arm in the drinking figure of the Soroya medal was too rigid. So for the first time here, again, we don't have Huntington ever commenting on the Soroya medallion design, but we have this figure of Starkweather, who is apparently working with Brenner and providing some insight and thoughts about the design and composition of the medal. And who is Starkweather? William E.B. Starkweather was a young, inspiring painter in New York City, and he goes to the Art Students League, and in 1900 heads to Paris to learn his craft. And in the 1900 Paris exposition, he discovers a Soroya painting that won the grand prize. And he would end up studying with Soroya for 3 years in Spain in the early 1900s. Starkweather comes back, in addition to being Soroya's pupil, Starkweather served as an adjunct curator to the Hispanic Society from 1910 to 1916. He also functioned as Soroya's guide, interpreter, artistic assistant, studio mate, and a confidant on Soroya's 1909 and 1911 visits to the United States. So after Soroya's time with, after Starkweather's time with Soroya in Spain, Starkweather comes back to the United States. He produces over 80 books. He's designing the covers to various books and literature pieces. And in 1909, as Soroya arrives for his exhibition at the Hispanic Society in January 1909, Soroya contacts Starkweather and lets him know that he's here in the United States. Starkweather goes up to see Soroya. Soroya is staying at a hotel at the southeast corner of Central Park, and Soroya, Huntington, and Starkweather are talking, and Starkweather, in fluent Spanish, is communicating with Soroya and realizing that what an asset the Spanish-speaking young American could be for Soroya. Huntington engaged Starkweather to accompany the master as a translator and administrator for the exhibition venue. This was a considerable responsibility, as the exhibit was scheduled to travel from New York to Buffalo and finally to Boston. And Starkweather oversaw the crating and uncrating of all of Soroya's work. And then, interestingly enough, in the preface to the international exhibit of contemporary medals of the ANS's exhibit in 1910, there on the front page of the 1911 edition, it says, owing to the difficulty of securing data from a considerable distance within a limited time. Many of the biographical sketches in the edition of 1910 were incomplete. In some cases, biographical data were not obtainable, and the number of illustrations was necessarily limited. Much valuable material was collected by the delegate of the society, Mr. William E.B. Starkweather, who visited the artists personally. So Huntington actually sends Starkweather to Europe to collect all of the medals for the ANS exhibit here in New York in 1910, which is quite an undertaking. And here, a couple of images, Starkweather and Soroya in New York in 1909. The painting on the left is a portrait of Starkweather himself, done by Soroya, which is at the museum, Hispanic Society Museum in New York. And again, Soroya returns to the United States in 1911, and here is a photograph of Soroya on the bottom right, Starkweather at the top, and Soroya's wife to the left in St. Louis in 1911. So this is a sketch we found in the Smithsonian by Starkweather. It's an interior perspective that he was commissioned by Huntington to do. I'm sure it has vibrant colors. Unfortunately, we don't know what that looks like. But Huntington also makes Starkweather the assistant curator of the Hispanic Society from 1910 to 1916. So I think probably the success of the ANS exhibit of the contemporary medals in 1910 really secured Starkweather's position and trust with Huntington within the Hispanic Society. Early painting done by Starkweather, 1909, a lot of similarities to Soroya's work. And in fact, if we have Starkweather consulting Brenner on the design of the Soroya medal, I could imagine that, or surmise that Starkweather is providing some guidance in the development of the medal itself and the composition of the figures. And then this is Starkweather Fishing, 1905 by Soroya, also in the Hispanic Society's museum. And interior of the exhibition hall for the International Exhibition of Contemporary Medals. We know that Victor Brenner also served on a committee to plan the exhibit. To what extent he contributed to that is not quite clear. He exhibited 69 pieces. And the Soroya Medallion was also included in that exhibit and struck in silver. It was number 30 in the catalog of Brenner's work. And then we have Archer M. Huntington, obviously an important figure in the ANS as president from 1905 to 1910 and founder of the Hispanic Society of America. And interestingly enough, Soroya is put on the ANS advisory committee. He's listed there in the front as an advisor to the exhibit and a member as well. So where did the Soroya medal come from? Scott showed an image of this earlier. This is inspiration. It was shown at an exhibit in Baltimore with the National Sculptor Society from April 4th to the 25th in 1908, 2 years prior to the Soroya Medallion. And Brenner exhibits 68 medals and plaques, 2 portraits, 1 bust, and this inspiration bas-relief of 2 men drinking from a spring and a rock formation in the background. So this is the first time that we see or have a record of the composition, if you will, of the Soroya Medallion. We also find in the Smithsonian Julie's photograph, also labeled inspiration with no date, presumably around 1908. But Smedley also does not list this plaquette. And then an overlay of the Soroya medal over the inspiration. Interestingly enough, the figure to the left, the male figure leaning over, holding a bowl with the rushing spring coming from the rocks, is identical to inspiration earlier on. So Brenner, it's not quite clear whether inspiration is an inspiration for the Soroya medal, possibly, or something else. I know Scott alluded to it being a plaque for a reservoir or aqueduct, which we'll talk about in a moment. But 1908, we know Huntington discovers Soroya, and that this inspiration bas-relief is created that same year. This is the Soroya Medallion, 1910, in the A&S collection, and the obverse to the left depicting a nude youth bending forward to drink from the mountain spring. 2 trees rise from the knoll in the background. Soroya inscription incised on the top left corner and signed at the bottom edge at the 4 o'clock position, V.D. Brenner. And on the, thank you. And on the reverse, we portrays a seated nude male painter in profile to the right with a brush in his extended right hand. Before him is a vase containing a medallic, mail stick and brushes. In the background, a large canvas with painted landscape, also signed by V.D. Brenner, sculptor, in exurge at the bottom. The Soroya Medal wasn't issued or awarded by the Hispanic Society until 1924. So it's not clear what happened between 1910 and 1924. Was the medallion created as a gesture of thanks in 1910, 1909 for Soroya's work here in the States and on the International Exhibition of Contemporary Medals? It's not quite clear, but the Society starts to award the Soroya Medallion by Brenner in 1924 and continues to issue that award today. Just, we talked about the Art of the Medal issued in 1910. In that, Brenner is talking about Chaplin and Roty's influence. And in a way, if you read the quotes, it seems as though Brenner's describing his own work. Here, he writes, in Chaplin's work, a remarkable boldness of plan, sober draftsmanship, and a fondness for heroic figuration are noticeable. He excels in characterization of the subject without losing the classical element. Here is a medallion by Chaplin, 1885, of Jerome, and a portrait to the left on the obverse, and a female personification of painting seated at an easel holding a brush to a canvas on the right. And she's surrounded by elements that refer to Jerome's Orientalist subjects, such as the Sphinx at the left and the mosque at the right, as well as the gladiator helmet, referring to his classical paintings. So, in many of the French medallic art, we see this theme of painters. We also see themes of the source or the spring, female figures drinking from a fountain or rocks. This is Roty's, a couple of his plaquettes from 1878 through 1900, kind of illustrating his painting plaquette, the spring or the source, la source, in the middle. And I put the Minds of Lens in there to the right, just because of the kind of contrast between the miner himself, which is somewhat sculpted in low relief, and then the kind of the jaggedness and roughness of the rocks itself, which is very reminiscent of Brenner's Soroya medal. And again, in the art of the medal, Brenner notes that Roty's art reveals other phases of thought. His art is saturated with the sensitiveness, imagination, and grace of the French character. He is both daring and subtle in his technique. Poetry and truth are delightful, mingled in his allegories and symbols. His draperies and garments display harmonious folds with exquisite transparency. And so in many respects, Brenner seems to be describing his own work in describing both Roty and Chaplin. And as I noted earlier, Chaplin dies in 1909, right before the International Exhibit of Contemporary Medals, and Roty dies a year later. So there's this kind of window where the Soroya Medallion is created in between the death of these two French mentors and medalists that may have influenced Brenner to some extent to recognize the masters. And then this is, again, some other references of French medalists referring to the spring, which was a common theme in French medallic art. Although most of the figures were female, it's interesting that Brenner on the Soroya medallion has these two kind of Herculean style figures that are drinking from the mountain. And it's interesting to note as well, Soroya painted in plein air outside, rarely in studio. He did even his portraits outside. And here, Soroya in 1912 is painting his types of Soroya in Spain. And he notes, as far as outdoor work is concerned, a studio is only a garage, a place in which to store pictures and repair them never a place in which to paint them. So it's the natural light that Soroya is seeking, and there are hundreds of photographs of Soroya out in the landscape with these gigantic canvases painting from life. And so we might look at the reverse of the Soroya medal by Brenner, and I think there's some references, photographs at least, in the Sorolla Museum in Madrid, where Sorolla is again out in the landscape, painting in plein air. And he exemplifies that, I think, on the reverse here, with this kind of heroic female nude. Or male nude, rather, I'm sorry. And then, oddly enough, in 1911, the inspiration piece by Brenner shows up in an exhibit at the Municipal Art Society in New York in 1911, and it's renamed The Breast of Nature. So Brenner, excuse me, has changed the name. It's noted that it was a commemorative tablet for a reservoir or aqueduct. It's not clear whether or not Brenner actually had a commission to do that, or if he was kind of marketing or remarketing, rebranding the piece that he had created back in 1908. And then the article goes on to say that Mr. Victor Brenner exhibits 3 small models of fountains and an important composition of life-size figures. So as Scott had pointed out earlier, this piece, this bas-relief is quite large. It's life-size. And he calls it the breast of nature. 2 kneeling youths with subtle mottled backs and arms drink a cooling draught at a spring which gushes from the ledge. This decoration forms a part of a commemorative tablet to be placed upon the wall of a projected reservoir. And I had only known of the one fountain. Scott had shown us 2 earlier, but I would say that this is probably one of 3 that are mentioned in that exhibit of 1911. And I'm not quite sure of the name, but it makes somewhat sense because, the composition and the execution of the fountain itself is very much like the Soroya medal, in that, we've got the roughness of the rock and the landscape, and these 2 figures in the landscape itself. And then I spoke earlier about correspondence with Brenner and John W. Beatty, who was a director of the Carnegie Institute Museum of Art. There are 80 files or documents in the Smithsonian, all cataloged chronologically from 1911 to 1918, leading up to Brenner's dedication of A Song to Nature, which Taylor spoke about earlier, that was revealed in Pittsburgh on September 2nd, 1918. And the interesting thing with that is after the Soroya Medallion, there are a couple other galvanos that are produced by Brenner that have a very similar style to the Sorolla Medallion, and we have a hint of it in Smedley's catalog of Brenner's work that talks about a flower box piece from which these medallions came from. And here in late December 1911, we've got correspondence between Beatty and Brenner Beatty is looking to Brenner to create a couple of sketches for a new medal for the Carnegie Institute. And Brenner replies, he's happy to do the work and needs a little more information. And here he has a card, a holiday card, if you will, that says, with Christmas and New Year greetings, Victor Brenner. And here on the card, we see the flower box design with the two medallions in the middle for the first time. And that's just an enlargement of the holiday card with the two medallions in the middle. To the left, well, we'll talk about those in a moment. And then we see also in Julie in the Smithsonian a piece called Earth and Water, although it doesn't have a date. It is in fact enlargements of the two pieces we see in the flower box design. But very similar style to the Sorolla medallion. And then these are from the A&S archive, large galvanos that one is La Terre, the earth, and La Source, the spring to the right that come out of that flower box. And Smedley actually notes that these are one of four motifs for the use for a flower box. And it is said to have been created as an ornament on a flower box, or possibly reproduction from a painting. So, it's not clear whether or not through the Soroya's medallion design and the collaboration with Starkweather that there's this precedent of Soroya's work that maybe influences the flower boxes about the same time, or just following the Soroya medallion. But again, very similar compositions. And so we only know of the one flower box, but then there are two other medallions or galvanos in the A&S records that are recorded. Dick Johnson gives a date as well as Smedley of 1917 for all four of these pieces. But I think just judging from the holiday card from Brenner in the Carnegie Institute archive, we could date those much earlier to around 1911, which is around the time of the Soroya medallion. And here we've got music to the left, with a woman holding a scroll. Perhaps she could also be called literature. It's not quite clear what she's holding. And then off to the right is a painting or art or a woman with palette. And clearly these two galvanos in composition complement each other and are probably the other two images of the flower box that we never see, although four medallions are identified. And so putting the Soroya medallion together with the galvanos from the flower boxes, you can kind of get a sense of a very different style from Brenner's earlier portrait work and other pieces in his portfolio. And I think all of them kind of go well together and probably are of a similar time period and influence. And then I just wanted to note in closing, Brenner, even in corresponding with John Beatty at the Carnegie Institute, Beatty actually, there are a couple of years go by after the first correspondence in 1911, and Beatty writes back to Brenner, says nothing's been made of the sketches, no decisions have been made of the sketches Brenner makes for the proposed medal for the Carnegie Institute. However, we've acquired a head of victory by Augustus Saint-Gaudens. And can you make a medallion from the head of victory? It would be a great piece to recognize not only the brilliance of Augustus Saint-Gaudens, but we were thinking maybe the head of victory could be used for our medal. And Brenner responds in various correspondence with Beatty that I work from pictures all the time and creating some medals. It's nothing new, and I'm happy to do that. And Beatty replies, I think, that he'll send some photographs. But here is the new Chivalry Medallion 1913, which clearly Brenner's working from a painting done by George Frederick Watts in 1860-62, and you could see the kind of correlation and precedent that the two are clearly from the same painting. And then in closing with the Beatty correspondence late in 1918, Brenner sends another holiday card. This is an image from the Smithsonian by Julie. It's a relief of a woman sewing. There is no date, but again, towards the end of the correspondence with Beatty, late in 1918, Brenner sends another holiday card with best New Year's greetings, Mr. and Mrs. V.D. Brenner. We know that Brenner was married to Anne in 1913, so the earlier Christmas greeting card, holiday card of the flower boxes precedes the 1913 marriage of the two. And it's interesting, the holiday cards, at least the two that I'm aware of, are pieces that I don't believe were struck or made, but here he's kind of marketing them and including them in holiday cards. And in a similar way, there are other pieces that Brenner creates, this one for the Peace of Versailles, in 1919. I would assume it was a competition as Chester Beach won that commission, but this is probably Brenner's submission, which was never used, but Brenner recycles that and reuses it years later for another relief of which I don't know the name, although it's been identified, I think, by Smedley as a relief of allegorical figures in the landscape. So Brenner is recycling things, works, commissioned pieces that maybe he never was awarded. And again, back to the Soroya Medallion and whether inspiration came out of the Soroya design, it's not quite clear, or was he just simply recycling an earlier work? And then in closing, I just thought it was interesting to note that, a few years after the International Exhibition of Contemporary Medals, we've got this other great exhibit that travels from New York to Chicago, the Armory Show, and it is in the art world a shocking exposition or exhibit of artwork, both in sculpture and painting. And I would imagine to a certain extent that that had some influence on the work of these artists in the United States in particular, and the work that they were doing at the time. So thank you very much. Any questions?
Thank you for that very interesting talk. The image you showed of the sewer looks like it was inspired by Oscar Roti's famous coin design. The sewer, the woman sewing?
Yes. Yes, it does.
Very much so.
Alexandre Charpentier also died that year.
I wanted to note, the exhibit of Sorolla's work at the Hispanic Society in 1909, over or close to 170,000 visitors to the museum in less than a month. And the year after, the International Exhibition of Contemporary Medals was a great success in everyone's mind, had 5,500 visitors. So within a year time frame, you could just see the extraordinary outcry of Soroya's work at the Hispanic Society. Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching the American Numismatic Society's YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like our online resources, publication, and events, you can support the Society by becoming a member. And don't forget to check out our book and eBay stores. The links are below.